This expression is the essence of negative utilitarianism. There is nothing in it that calls for violence, it merely illustrates the very idea of justifying the less evil if it prevents the greater. The quote is an obvious thought experiment. The presentation of NU as having a violent view is clearly untrue and unfair on the part of the authors of the letter. Most people are probably an obstacle in reducing suffering. Most people do not have worldviews focused solely on suffering, and a large part of the ordinary functioning of most of humanity ultimately leads to increased suffering in the world through the reproduction, use of animals, and other people. This does not justify hating people or wishing them to suffer. As in the first commented cases, I find Gary's idea extremely impractical and ineffective, and promoting it as ill-considered. It does not change the fact that a perfectly designed plan of humane genocide, a plan devised by an intelligence far superior to any human, and focused solely on the ultimate minimization of suffering, should be considered a plan worthy of execution. However, no genocidal solution undertaken without such intelligence can succeed, and any attempt to implement or propagate it can only have negative effects, and lead to an unimaginable amount of unnecessary suffering. The view presented above is completely alien to me. Nothing of the view expressed here is consistent with mine, and I completely reject the ideas presented by the creator of the term effilism. It is true that irrational people are ineffective, but it is important to remember that few of us, if any, can ultimately determine which views are rational and which are not. The idea of arbitrarily or partially arbitrarily selecting a society in terms of rationality may be a good way to function effectively in utopian societies, or it may even become our future regime, but its aim can never be anything other than reducing suffering inside and outside society. The idea of throwing people deemed stupid into prisons is utterly, absolutely flawed, as is their execution. This does not mean that the decision-making powers of some irrational persons should not be limited for the universal good, but such action is currently not practical to do, and any persecution of anyone for their intellectual beliefs or abilities is unacceptable. Like many of Gary's ideas expressed in a similar vein, I find them completely ineffective and therefore misguided, and to present it so confidently, irresponsible. I agree if you can fix something by violent means, using that means is a reasonable action. It doesn't change the fact that there are less and more reasonable choices, and violence is at the bottom of the list as a final evil, only allowed when other measures are less effective. I believe that the necessity to use violence can be kept to a minimum, and that this is exactly what should be the goal of those interested in practical solutions to reduce suffering. In theory, this is exactly the same mechanism that allows a painful procedure to be performed to prevent an even more painful disease. Exactly the same if a child or other person would need to undergo such a procedure. Violence, however, is hardly ever the only option, and it is imperative to avoid it whenever possible while remaining effective. This is indeed a core of both negative utilitarianism and effilism, that suffering should be reduced by any means that don't cause greater suffering. Anyone who disagrees with that has to disagree with both of them as well. It doesn't say violence is necessary for any situation, but it doesn't dismiss that either. I am interested in the argumentation of those who oppose that claim. The notion that it is irrational to cause less suffering to prevent more of it sounds abstract to me. It does. I cannot possibly see how one can argue differently, as it's pretty obvious violence is a possible solution. It doesn't change the fact it is the least preferable solution, as it inflicts suffering. If there is an effective option that includes suffering and one that does not, it is unjustifiable to use the first one. But if there is the only efficient option that includes suffering because of violence, it is unjustifiable not to use it. It must be noted that this says absolutely nothing about the practical application of violence, which does not change the fact that it has been and is widely used in wars and confrontations of all kinds. Violence works, and is the worst solution if it is a solution at all. Hating violence cannot lead to denying its potential effectiveness. I have no problem with this statement. It is very clear. The rational vision of effilism, if it is rational, as the creator of the word believes, will most likely prevail, if we consider that the rational view of the world and behavior in it are what ultimately triumphs. I see no problem in holding to believe that the rational view will be the one victorious. And I think most of us think their worldview is indeed rational. Urinating on graves of enemies is largely humorous, but assuming it is not, it would in fact not hurt anyone. In a hypothetical scenario, in a land inhabited by dying negative utilitarians, it would currently hurt families and would have a negative mimetic impact, and bringing a slight satisfaction to the pisser would reduce his discomfort. Effilism, as it attributes a negative value to the creation of life, is included in anti-natalism. However, it is a more specific view. If I were to say this, I would mean to emphasize the narrowest affiliation, not to exclude myself from wider ones. A known anti-theist is certainly a non-theist, but if during a public debate or in public space he was identified and associated with non-theism, it could cause him righteous indignation. Although technically true, it does not reflect the views clearly enough, because it is anti-theism, not non-theism, that is the hallmark and flagship worldview of the described person. In a similar vein, cutting away from being called an anti-natalist because you subscribe to effilism does not exclude anyone from being an anti-natalist. If Gary meant it, I agree with him. If he didn't mean it, and he thinks that as an effilist he does not qualify for anti-natalism, I disagree with him if we define anti-natalism as above. It is possible that Gary does not identify with common thought trends in or associated with anti-natalism, such as reproduction is always unacceptable or anti-natalism should focus on people and excludes himself from such anti-natalists, or that he uses a slightly different definition of anti-natalism. To call it fantasizing about mass murder is false. The statement presented in the way above is a thought experiment. I don't have enough knowledge or data to tell if the timeframe is realistic, but surely if effilism is rational, and if stupid people are less rational, chances are good for this to happen. This does not mean that such a move is in practice neither profitable nor feasible. This is negative utilitarianism. I 100% agree. I am interested in how people who disagree with this statement would behave, put in a situation where they could either torture one person for an hour or refuse, as a result of which a billion other people will be tortured even more cruelly for thousands of years. I think this hyperbolized example shows the point. In my opinion, it is blatantly obvious that anything can be justified if it leads to the ultimate minimization of suffering. And this in no way means that we are allowed to inflict suffering just because we subjectively think it will pay off. In practice, we have no data to assess whether actual, unlawful torture has a chance to reduce suffering. I believe it isn't profitable, but the hypothetical examples remain valid. I do not agree. This is an ineffective solution, both in practice and in theory. Painless elimination of some people could already be profitable today, yet would require the wiping of their families and often countries from the face of the earth, but it is also a dubious solution. Certainly absolutely impossible in a worthwhile way without nanotechnology and reprogramming human mentality. As an effilist, I dissociate myself from this claim. I dissociate myself from this statement. Something like justice is a beautiful delusion in a world without free will. The very idea of just punishment disgusts me. If Inmendham were comfortable in the role of an executioner, I understand that. I would not, and I do not find it profitable to pursue or affirm such a state of mind. Nobody deserves to be tortured. I understand irritation towards people with completely different intuitions or irrational views, but fostering hatred for them does not lead to anything constructive. On behalf of myself and other like-minded effilists, I distance myself from this and any other hatred. I do not harbor the hatred that emanates from the second quote. But I understand it. As human population growth is driven mainly by poor and uneducated people, they are the ones that are the cause of the biggest problems. However, they cannot be considered cruel and evil. We are all animals, irrational hominids, acting by default guided by our instincts and evolutionary useful intuitions. The problem cannot be solved by another irrationality, which in my opinion is misanthropy in the forms known to me. I can't see how a rational person could consider the words used in the citation as a manifestation of homophobia. These are commonly used words, which in themselves are in fact an echo of past, universal homophobia, and it is safer not to use them, but to extrapolate their use to hatred of non-heteronormative people is a pitiful move. I do not think it is safe to take actions aimed at destroying the Earth at present. I believe we need superintelligence to avoid possible cosmic suffering. Nor do I see a real threat to the planet from people who consider the current actions to destroy the Earth to be desirable. We should develop technologies that sterilize the cosmos, and superintelligence will choose the most effective way of destroying the world, be it nuclear bombs, meteors, throwing into the sun, or nanotechnology. Benatar's position can and should be criticized, like any authority figure. I myself disagree neither with him nor with Gary on many points. In this case, I do not think that we have the possibility of destroying the world in a profitable way now, so in practice, I consider Benatar's strategy of philosophical discourse more effective than the practical postulation of controversial solutions. I also think the word moral is impractical in many contexts. I consider the existence of absolute morality nonsense, but that does not mean that there is no universal rational course of action. I believe that negative utilitarianism meets the standards of such a view. I don't find consent important as of a fundamental value. This does not mean that I am going to disrespect or violate it. It is an impractical approach. We are all irrational and gifted both with the illusion of an unchanging person and the illusion of free will. Understanding others to minimize irrationality is the key to communication, and it is certainly not impulsiveness that helps. The right to cease to exist should be the right of every human being, especially those who cannot even kill themselves, such as prisoners or the mentally ill. I do not consider the idea of forced euthanasia as universally good, or worth implementing at all. Certainly, it would be better for many mentally ill people to die, and I hope it will be possible in the future, provided it is done in a dignified manner that does not cause suffering. The details of such a system, however, require very extensive discussion, and the matter is by no means as simple as presented by Gary. I subscribe to the view that the average person has a negative value. I agree that eliminating a large proportion of average people could improve the situation. Such a hypothetical example, however, cannot be implemented in practice, considering the social and mimetic effects of killing an average person in the name of minimizing suffering. They would, in my opinion, annihilate any profit resulting from the death of such a person with their negativity. I don't know how it would be legal to kill average people, but assuming that, it would probably happen in a frighteningly oppressive system. It might be argued it would be worthwhile after all to legally kill people to reduce future suffering, but I doubt it is reasonable to do so without a massive amount of data that would confirm it is indeed worth it. Certainly, a lot of information would be needed to make such a decision, and I also believe that working towards the abolition of such a system, in which murdering fellow citizens is legal, would be more valuable than killing random people. The disappearance of most people in the simplified model of the world could actually be profitable, but I do not know if in the very complex world we find ourselves, the same can be said. The reasons are social influences, taking uninhabited places by natural environment bustling with suffering, etc.